Уважаемые участники третьего Московского урбанистического форума, пленарное заседание на тему «Ключевые подходы к развитию территории Москвы» начинается прямо сейчас в зале А.
Dear participants of the Third Moscow Urban Forum, the plenary session, Key Approaches to Moscow's Territorial Development, is starting now in Hall A. Thank you.
И мы с радостью приглашаем на сцену модератора сессии Грега Кларка.
We are very pleased to invite to the stage the moderator of the session, Greg Clark.
And as you might note from your program, it is actually Jonathan Wetzel. It's my pleasure, first of all, to invite our speakers to the stage. I'm going to start with Mr. Alexei Muratov, a partner at DB Strelka, line manager for the Territorial Development Strategy. Mr. Alexei Muratov. I'd also like to invite Mr. Alexei Novikov, the managing director of Thomson Reuters in Russia, to the stage, also a co-leader of the project. Mr. Marat Khusnullin, the Deputy Mayor of Moscow for Urban Development and Construction in the Moscow City Government. Ms. Ellen Dunham-Jones, Professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology and Chair of the Board of the Congress for the New Urbanism. And finally, Mr. Ricky Burdett, the Director of the London School of Economics Urban Age Project. Welcome to the final plenary session of the Moscow Urban Forum. During the 2 days of this forum, there have been over 2,900 delegates attending, with 254 speakers from over 35 countries. Over 384,000 people have read about the forum in the social media, with over 4,000 messages. And you've all spent about 11 hours here. So congratulations, you've made it. And congratulations, I should also add, to the organizers of this event. I think this has been, by any standards, a world-class event with great importance, not only for Moscow, but for cities around the world. We are going to start off this final session, however, with a presentation of the paper that was developed and the research that was done for this forum. So we will first invite Mr. Alexei Muratov to the stage to present highlights. My apologies. Mr. Alexei Novikov to the stage to present the highlights of the social, economic, and data recommendations on outskirts development. Mr. Novikov.
Добрый день, уважаемые дамы и господа.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great honor just to talk to you this afternoon. Before just I will come out with the main conclusions of the economics and sociology and information. Just let me just give you some prerequisites that we worked upon. First, we worked on the assumption that Moscow agglomeration is a gigantic economy. There's a 25th economy in the world. It's the size of the economy of Iran or Sweden, so the same GDP as New York, a $3 trillion GDP, just like New York. This is the country, which is the city. And so this economy certainly is biased. It's imbalanced. It's not our fault, but because of macroeconomic conditions. And it's the fault of the Dutch disease that happened and has been happening in Russia over the last 10 years, several decades, because the national currency strengthened, because of the dollars coming in, and thus one of the most reliable natural assets that we could invest in Russia, both by corporations and citizens, is real estate. And real estate that was supported by a great deal of demand because of the shortage of real estate and unique position of Moscow in this market. And that's why the economic model of Moscow agglomeration is built around real estate, about housing, purchase, private property of the sector of real estate. So this is a huge capital-intensive economy where a lot of companies in their size, from the viewpoint of number of people employed, so is bigger than Gazprom, Rosneft, and Vodokhanal and others. So huge companies where the mistake in any city development mistake could be very costly, and the implications were better, like General Motors bankruptcy, because they did not get the correct product line of their cars, and they went bankrupt. So then let's talk about the sites. So this gigantic spatial bias, because the Moscow spatial bias, it's like Detroit. It's the city with clear-cut zoning, administrative center, industrial zones, and housing construction. And zone of housing. To manage such city, to live in such city is interesting but very challenging. And so we can see that from the economic viewpoint, this kind of combination leads to the scenario whereby two scenarios. So first scenario is the cyclical degradation scenario, which at the end of the day continues the trends that we can observe now. So increasing of the density of the population and the periphery just spilling outside the Moscow, and so not enough infrastructure, social infrastructure that adds to the additional traffic, heavy traffic, and many other headaches and problems and scenarios where the real estate is still very, very high. So then 12% is the range that within which the real estate prices swing. So in New York, then the difference is 70% at the periphery. So the real estate is 70% cheaper than downtown. In Moscow, it's only 12%. That is why. So there's the investment windfall that is occurring now, and without any coherent city design policy, we cannot continue to get this rent, to get this benefit of this biased economy, and so the institutional capabilities that we have currently. At the same time, all this is happening against the background whereby such a big mega city as Moscow is moving into a different status. So it means that 30% of the population of European mega cities have enough money and free time not to go to work every day. And thus the city designed for labor migration stops to be so. And Moscow is not that way. But if you read through the studies, you will see that all the movements, 70% is around getting from where people live to where they work. 70% of movements. And so including children, pensioners, kids, students, workers, and so they unfortunately take up the lion's share of the traffic in the morning and in the evening, and so there's a gigantic load on the transportation network. And so can you imagine what happens if the remaining part of the population starts to use actively the city infrastructure. If other population who do not just go to work start to use it, will be swamped. And in all probability, so the from a strategic viewpoint, so we need to move towards finding solutions to this issue. So we talk about 50-year, 100-year time horizon. We create conditions for a choice. And so we think about the people. We're not creating any mechanism of social engineering, and we're not just cutting it out, because we don't know what it will look like. So we need just to give a chance to people and to the economy to develop by itself and people by themselves. And also then that's why we need just to introduce the legal zoning. And certainly that's a questionable measure. We have not yet started it, but the economy, which is as big as that of Iran, to use only a limited amount of instruments, it's impossible. So the land tax, real estate tax is less than 1% of the budget, and this is not sufficient as well. That's why the urban policy in the form of zoning So we cannot do it all at once, but it will be phased in. So this zoning, legal zoning policy. And so now we need just to move the city from getting rent for the real estate leased by the people and migrate it to another plane, so to work with the city just for the benefit of the population. Then increasing the infrastructural projects at the periphery, at the fringe of this city, on the fringes of the city. And so then there is a big gap between the availability of infrastructure between the periphery and the downtown. And this is the syndrome of those years and the legacy of the previous years. So then the concept of free planning that was at fault for that, because it was implemented large-scale, long-term social project. Unfortunately, it's not good for the market conditions, because free planning does not give a chance to small, medium businesses to create the necessary flow of people, food traffic, employees, etc. And it doesn't work that way. So the quality of city planning, of urban planning, goes counter to the market requirements. And so we need just to step up the construction of infrastructure. And we need to go hand in hand with the solutions of urban solutions in this area. So probably just to connect those areas of free planning and creating so different companies of social and cultural nature. Then employment. So there's no need just to turn industrial zones into new housing zones. It's a good chance what San Francisco did 30, 40 years ago, to set up the centers of employment, centers that could be both residential and employment areas as well, so where people live and work, and so the social, from the viewpoint of the social roles of the people involved. Another very important subject that is revealed from the results of the sociological studies and information, it's the road system is becoming more and more complicated. So the small streets appear, and the connections become more convoluted and complicated. And so then there is a lot of people living in those areas, and they're coming from one periphery to another periphery at the fringes of the city, and so they are migrating from one to back and forth. And we cannot just superimpose today's transport behavior onto the paradigm of what's going to happen in 50 years. And so we need just to create a very dense network, and within which the population and the economy will find the best solution. And the density of the city is by a magnitude of 1 is less than anywhere else. An order of magnitude 1 less than anywhere else. Then, and eventually the last point, we are talking about the use of information and data. In order to, so that the city community could self-tune, self-adjust, calibrate concerning the issues and challenges. So, for example, mobile Yandex traffic jams so actually saved hundreds of billions of dollars of investments, because now it allows us, anyone can see where the traffic jams are. And so to adapt the traffic to the situation in the streets. And so that's a very good application. So there could be concerning consumption and other resources consumption. The same applications may be developed and used, and a lot of load will be taken off the government of Moscow. And in this respect, people will be making their own contribution. And because the city is, at the end of the day, is people, is made of people. And they should address a lot of challenges by themselves. Infrastructure should help. Thank you.
Mr. Novikov, for a very precise and directed summary of the implications for the social, economic, and data requirements of the strategy. Now I'd like to invite Mr. Muratov to the stage to present the second half on architecture, urban planning policy, and urban culture. Recommendations on outskirts development.
Добрый вечер, дорогие друзья.
Good evening, dear friends, I'll try to be brief, and I'll try to make some conclusions and recommendations concerning the urban policy, architecture, and culture. So I will speak about the issues related to the spatial development. So the first prerequisite and the first conclusion that we worked upon, departed upon, concerning this donut and Moscow industrial outskirts. So we need a strategy of an innovation development. So we need to maintain and retain what we have. We should not just raze to the ground everything. It's preferable for many reasons. We should not destroy everything because these territories have a good potential that needs to be tapped. So from the viewpoint of social environment and from the viewpoint of the more efficient use of land and more efficient use of the existing house developments. And so our research came to the conclusion that Moscow periphery of the mega city of the similar dimensions is not in such a bad shape because those centralized managerial mechanisms that we always criticize, and so that's we are very skeptical about their efficiency. There are some reasons for that, but sometimes we overdo it because they were at the end of the day quite efficient. And so they are still working pretty well, those management mechanisms, and that is why we need to tinker with it rather than being an engineer. So we need just to evolve it. We need to learn to devolve, to empower, and then we need to remember that so this window of opportunities which we have in the territorial development area, so that's it's turning already from a big window into a small chink in the window, and we need to be quick, and so we need just to start big city changes, and this has related to the second point. So we think that we need an articulated, coherent urban development policy in generally and properly coherent policy of city development concerning periphery, concerning outskirts, the fringes. And so this is the ideology of development of the city and those districts presented to us publicly, openly, and openly discussed mechanisms and instruments related to this ideology of development. So at the previous session we discussed the issue of land use, and so there are two different ideological approaches. One is Singapore type approach, whereby 70% of the land is managed by the state and administration, only 30 is privately owned in Singapore. There is another approach that we refer to as Moscow, let's say Moscow when zoning was done, so then it was the other way around. 70% was city territories and 70 was private territories. And so this is a discussion. So both approaches are legit, and so we need to find a consensus, a happy medium, and this happy medium approach will allow us to conduct more logical, reasonable policy that has been properly shaped. And then we need. Everyone is talking about the master plan of the reconstruction of Moscow 2010. That we need certainly a concerted effort in the area of planning in the dimensions of the agglomeration. And in spite of the fact that people are unhappy about the lack of legislative instruments, people are complaining about that. Our experts properly analyze this situation, and there are lots of instruments. They are sufficient to make the strategy of urban development at the level of Moscow and Moscow region. And then this combination of long-term, short-term strategies of development on the basis of combination of the master plan and general plan, and this issue so has been discussed at the last forum, and we need to point out that The document of territorial planning, which is part of the general plan, has certain weaknesses and drawbacks, which combines together so long-term, short-term, tactical and strategic points, and as a result, it's become kinds of disparate. And there is a collision related to this imbalance of the new construction, housing and infrastructural development, budget disparity between and the plans of social infrastructure construction, and so which is part of the plan. So that's why certainly we would recommend and would repeat it, reiterate it again from the last session, that certainly would like to have to come to a strategic document, to develop strategic goals with clear-cut structure, transparent goals and objectives. So that should be part of the city construction code, and then the plan should be performed short-term or mid-term perspective. Then, in spite of the fact that the research provides for certain abstraction and certain generalization, but the districts of this panel periphery, they require differentiated approach. They're all different, although they look the same, but they're all different. And here I would recommend to look to borrow French experience, to study their experience when the urban zones, when there were certain set of indicators and they identified the most challenging areas, and that's where they start to develop them first. So the territorial zoning, they're thinking what to do with those problematic zones, districts, to bring them to a higher level from the marginal status to a more developed status. And so that's why we need just to have this multifaceted approach. And so because the policy is not very well thought out, but we need to involve more. And the last point from my brief list of important measures, which is related to the fact that today we're witnessing the growth of social activity, civil activity. People are becoming more active and improving their environment and culture. And my colleagues, the Higher School of Economics, so they worked on the area of Troparova and Nikulina district, and Moscow Library Management Committee dealt with another district, and then the Higher School of Urban Development worked on it as well. And as much people have no place, no venue where they could get together and discuss things, and because usually when there is a meeting of all residents, they usually meet on the ground floor, in the lobby, and that's the only place to discuss things. And also that's why these libraries, the premises could be used as venue places, and to keep up alive. So this beginning to burn a flame of civil initiatives. Those civil initiatives certainly need accounting and legal support, and so thank you. Thank you. Very, very short list. Thank you.
Presenting the architectural, urban planning, and cultural aspects of the plan. Now, if I could invite Deputy Mayor Khusnullin to give a reaction, perhaps, to what you have just heard, and as well any comments that you would like to make on the overall progress of the forum.
I would like to thank all for the participation. That the work that you've done is invaluable for Moscow development. That's the first point I wanted to make. And then, because we've been working yesterday, today, and just we listened and worked, what the main salient points that I would like to make, what we think are the most important from the previous presentations. It is true that the standardized, unified plan of the development of Moscow and Moscow region is inevitable. Is it in the way of legislation or not in the way? But we need to do it, because if we discuss the issue of periphery of Moscow, then periphery, it's Moscow region already. This is periphery. It's not because it's not Moscow fringes, but remembering the new Moscow. So because Moscow region has become the periphery, because they become the new fringes of the city, because they do not conform to the administrative boundaries of the city anymore. So we have expanded. need to work.
And we are finishing the work according to plan. We have started this activity. We are doing it with the colleagues, but we understand we need to accelerate it. And most important, it's not simply doing this development plan, but the practical measures to fulfill it. I believe this is going to be much more difficult because we have specific restrictions, constraints, administrative, financial, whatever, you name it. And we shall try to do a document, at least our mayor, Mr. Sabanin, instructed, so asked us not just to make a general plan in the Russian understanding of the word, but the general plan merged with the master plan and the implementation plan as well. So 3 in 1, that's what we have to do. And another thing that we have all overlooked, probably it's our fault, we somehow overlooked the garden communities. Probably our foreign colleagues do not know that those dacha communities are very developed, very popular. If you look around Moscow, huge territories belong to those little garden dachas. And as the urbanization is expanding beyond the boundaries of the cities, we shall need to make decisions on each of those garden community, because this dachas is our mentality. This is our way of life. And just we cannot, make our plans and do something on those territories. Just hurting people is going to raise social issues, to cause social unrest. That's why we need to consider those territories. And I can tell you that in this new Moscow, we have 1,100 those dacha communities, or kind of not exactly cottages, but the dacha garden oil plots of land with a little house. And those infrastructural projects, especially for Moscow, with insufficient road space, with overloaded transportation. We should understand that the theory of infrastructure development will be the pillars of other theories, and our colleagues' experience will be of much value, and we definitely want to build our efforts on the core transportation backbone of our city. And this transportation backbone will really determine all other developments. That's what I wanted to bring to your attention, to focus on. Thank you.
Now if I could turn to our experts on the panel to give some of their reactions. First to Professor Dunham-Jones. Reactions to the direction of the plan from perhaps both an architectural but also from an overall urban planning perspective.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here. Oh, I'm not on.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me and including me. It's been absolutely fascinating to learn much more about what Moscow is doing and seeing the very ambitious plans for new Moscow, as well as the plans I have loved seeing all of the research and mapping that's been done on the donut, as Alexei referred to it. I think, the plan, in many respects, for New Moscow certainly is, I think, the intentions, everything that I'm hearing in terms of the intentions sounds really very, very promising. I mean, I think it's much like the forum itself. There's a terrific set of ideas, topics. There's been, in fact, I'd say at the forum, I've heard remarkably little disagreement. It seems like everyone kind of agrees we need to build in a much more walkable, transit-oriented, affordable way. We need to preserve those places that we value, the forests, the dachas. Very little disagreement. But what it does somewhat concern me is that I think it's possible to kind of come away from all of this thinking of these aspects as a checklist. Okay, we need to have affordable housing, check. We need to have schools, hospitals, check. Public places, we need to have, of course, transit, 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 check. But the real challenge is integrating all of those, not as a checklist, but designing them in a way where they reinforce each other and create really great cities. Cities are extremely complex organisms, and it actually requires being willing to embrace that complexity and not being afraid of the fact that, yes, you need a master plan for the streets and the transportation, but at the same time, you can't control everything, and you have to be willing to frankly embrace the lack of control. And I think it's especially, this new way of thinking that you can't control everything is especially important in terms of how we operate in the periphery. Because whether you're talking about Moscow's micro-regions, I know I'm not pronouncing that correctly, or whether you're talking about American suburbs, most of the development that we did in the 1960s and 70s around the world, we tended to design in a very top-down, engineered kind of methodology that sort of thought the more we separate out each problem, then we can optimize it. So if we just have the traffic engineers only focus on traffic, then we get highways and we solve traffic, but we aren't even thinking about the quality of life or the impact that has on the adjacent land. If we, and similarly then we deal with housing by only thinking about the design of the unit and not about what it's like, whether you can walk to shops and convenient mixes of uses. So I'm excited to see how much discussion there is of really trying to integrate a mix of uses with obviously much more transit, much more attention to avenues instead of highways, I hope. But I think it really is it's a way of thinking that is not thinking so much as a checklist where you're sort of optimizing for each variable, but thinking much more in terms of designing great places and really trying, it's amazing how if you can just start with that one move of a sort of a walkable block grid of streets that can get you through, you get so many more benefits to health, to environment, to economics. It's more affordable, it's more equitable, it's more sustainable. You can put in district energy systems. All of those good things start to overlay very naturally on it. But I come away really wanting to know whether the existing parts of that donut, could there be more attention to infilling the older Soviet neighborhoods with more of a mix of use, with cutting more streets through to accommodate that newer growth by increasing the street network, not just by increasing the width of roads. Obviously adding more transit's a great thing, but increasing a mix of uses so that people don't have to travel quite so much. And I think some of those same ideas can be applied to New Moscow, but I'd love to also see them really applied that much more still within the periphery. But it does take a slight change of mindset and getting away from that trying to overly control and engineer it. So thank you very much for including me.
Thank you, Professor Dunham-Jones. And Professor Burdett, I was one of the 300,000 who was graced to pass through the halls of the Tate Modern during the Urban Age exhibition, so I'm anxious to hear your perspectives from looking at cities globally. What do you see from this plan and from this forum?
Well, I think the first thing to observe is that events like these can do very important things, not just bring people together, but actually do something more fundamental than that, which is to use research to inform policy. To use research to inform policy. I repeat that because it's not obviously like that. Normally, policy is just decided. that politicians, as distinguished as the ones we have here, or in London or elsewhere, have a hunch of what they want to do. And what I want to applaud and congratulate this conference and the city authorities is that actually you put your money where your mouth is and you actually commission research. So the fact that you can walk through and spend many hours, and I would like to spend many more, looking at data, very complex data, which proves the exact point that you've made, that cities are multi-level, is very, very important. So that would be a first reflection. Connected to that, the fact that you have chosen, you as a conference and you as a city, to focus on the periphery is incredibly important. All I can say, if I were in Mexico City today, I don't want to make analogies between Mexico City and Moscow, but Mexico City is a city, I have written a book with a colleague of mine called The Endless City. A city that just goes on as, we are sitting here, I can't see the end of the room. Mexico City is like you. It just continues forever and ever. The mere fact that you have decided in Moscow to tackle this difficult problem is very, very important. Many cities do not have the courage to do that because it's actually much more complicated. Often because the votes are in the center and not on the edge. At one level, to use a very technical term, it's not sexy to talk about the periphery. And I think the fact that you're focusing on that is significant. And you're using research to inform that. But I'm very interested when I see Moscow to understand where it starts and where it ends. You talk about the donut effect. Of course, many of you know the debates about the jurisdiction and who's in charge. But there's one fundamental difference between Moscow and other cities, which you can see with a night satellite view of the whole of wider Europe, which is that Moscow is much, much bigger than many other cities, even than Istanbul and certainly London. And if I compare it now just to London, there's one simple reason why. You can't see from the back of the room, but I'm going to show you the London plan, right? Here it is. This is the London plan. It's a circle, more or less like Moscow, a bit smaller. It has a river through it, and it has a lot of stars. Right? The circle is not just the legal boundary, it's the boundary beyond which you cannot build, full stop. It's called the Green Belt, and it was invented by one of the greatest planners of the 20th century called Patrick Abercrombie. Now, you could say that this very simple idea of keeping the Green Belt is outdated. It's from the mid-20th century. But it actually has served London incredibly well, and I want to come back to that. Because connection between the containment boundary, as we call it, the Green Belt, and the dots, the stars, is very important. Because the dots, the stars, are the zones where the current mayor, for the second time effectively after 2 mayors in 10 years, has designated, exactly as you have in Moscow, as areas of mixed use, high density, intensification, but only and only where there is good public transport, only. None of the dots, none of the stars are in places where there is not rail, bus, and other forms of integration. So any area that you can get to just by car, NITS, not allowed, not allowed. So I'm making a big point about planning, which follows from Murat, but also a big point about economic planning, because, and this is probably worth debating, and I can't respond to your the knowledge base here, but the connection between economic sustainability and planning is very, very clear. And I would have thought the one lesson that we have learned in the last 30, 40 years everywhere is to allow the market to do exactly what it wants is a really bad idea. This is not saying let us return to total interventionist policy, but some sort of guidance, some sort of vision of what the city wants to be, I think is absolutely central to that. So I think that you have this wonderful opportunity now with the research that you've developed to say, okay, where does the city stop? Do we really need to double the size? Really? When there's, as you've just said, the possibility of intensifying the very loose fabric that you built in the last 40 or 50 years. Also because those are extraordinary opportunities for the market. And the final point I think I would like to make here is the relationship between the market, planning, and policy. I think we've probably learned in the last 15 years in London, where we've only, and let's not forget this, we have only had an elected mayor in London since the year 2000. We are babies when it comes to urban democracy. Here you've had it for much longer. Since the year 2000, where the first mayor created the London Plan, which I just showed you, there was an enormous awareness to make London and keep London competitive and not sell out to other countries in Europe and Germany or elsewhere. We wanted to attract as much inward investment as possible from the Middle East, from Asia, and all that. This plan, which I've shown you, does one thing. It constrains the market. It does, because it says you can't do what you want. But it does do one thing. It gives it certainty. And I think Jonathan, of all people at this table, knows how important for business is to have certainty. And in many ways, what I'm getting at is one critical thing here, which is the relationship between, I guess, private investment and public good. I think what a good plan in any city does is monitor and moderate those two relationships. Private benefit, investment, and public good for those who cannot afford to do that. And it seems to me to provide certainty is essential. And let me give you, and I will close, Jonathan, with this point. In London, we have a housing crisis. I think probably very similar land values here. There's very similar problems of the cost of affordability that we have here. And, you know, if we compare the cost per square meter, I think very, very similar issues, even though you have a lower, actually, income base. So it's even more problematic here. In the UK, in Britain, there has been for 50, 60 years, particularly since the Second World War, a tradition of providing social housing. That has changed with different governments, Mrs. Thatcher, Tony Blair, our current government. But the Mayor of London has a very, very straightforward policy. 1 out of every 10 housing units, every 10, sorry, not 1, 3 out of every 10 housing units have to be affordable, and under the previous mayor it was 5. So between 3 and 5 out of every 10, 30 and 50% out of every development that is done has to be somehow affordable, right? Now you may say this is crazy. No developer is going to come and build in this situation. They don't make enough money. But if you provide the certainty that that will remain the case for some time, actually a developer will do that. They know that's what you have to do. And then that way, I think you mediate the public good and the private interest, but within this framework which brings economic sort of well-being with well-planned cities that you were referring to before. And I would have thought that's the biggest challenge for, by the way, any of us in these cities. It's sometimes tough decisions because you don't get re-elected on these ideas. You know, it's not, as I would say again, a sexy subject to talk about, but I think that's at the heart of the design of a sustainable city. Can I add, actually, sorry, one last point on it. I am struck, and if I want to end on a slightly negative note, how not just at this panel, but also throughout the panels I've been at, how there's hardly been the mention of the word climate change. I'm actually quite shocked. When you think of the traffic levels that you have here, when you think of the size, when you think of the footprint of your city, the fact that environment is referred to as walkable environments is fine, but the fact that you are custodians of one of the largest cities in the world and one of the most powerful countries in the world, I think that that issue of just environmental responsibility should be part of exactly the same arguments that you're putting forward. It goes the same way. It doesn't take you anywhere else. I just found it missing in the discussion of what's been said up until now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky, and I think that actually that is a very excellent point. If I could add one or two small comments from my own perspective, building on what you said. Success has to be an integrated view of economics, society, and environment. These things go together. We see no economically advanced cities which are not equally, over time, environmentally developed, and nor can you disenfranchise the majority of your population and hope to have a successful economy either. So these economic, society, environment, they do go together, and successful policy recognizes the externalities that growth creates, whether it's an environmental externality. And I just came from Shanghai, and people are sending me pictures of the smog today in Shanghai. Apparently it's a really bad day in Shanghai. It's a good day in Beijing, really bad day in Shanghai. So I suspect that here in Moscow you will have similar issues which will be equally visible or invisible, as the case might be. One other thing I would mention that hasn't been spoken of as much, perhaps, is the role of migration and migrants in cities, which is also a very significant externality. And some cities take the approach of controlling that, and others take the approach of recognizing and integrating them. And I think the history shows that the cities that are good at integrating migrants are the ones that ultimately become more successful because they become more productive. They grow faster. They achieve greater economic development. So how to do that? But many people in this audience, I think, are equally expert on aspects of this, and I actually wanted to take this opportunity to call on two of them who are here. And if I could start by asking Alexander Vysokovsky, the Dean of the High School of Urbanism, to make a few remarks, and perhaps, yes, I think come to the podium would be great. Thank you so much.
Спасибо большое за...
Thank you very much for the opportunity to share about our activity and the forum on the whole. I would primarily want to come back again to the point that Richard mentioned. I believe this is a very important trend to have such an important and research before this forum, and a well-prepared, well-grounded and founded research. And I think it's high time we seriously increase the attention and resources to the research activities with very specific goal, that is to elucidate the situation to do with city building policy, city development, urban building policy. So from everything that's happening and is told, we need to understand we do many things in Moscow for the first time in my life. We don't have this long and good history that our colleagues were talking of, democratic development. We're new, we're fresh, we're a toddler, but what we try to understand, what's happening, what happened. We are now at the pivotal point of self-definition, and we need to admit, we need to acknowledge that. Last year, the Moscow government, and this year, Moscow government has done many important steps to determine the city building. We made this big Moscow contest between the architectural bureaus. It was a powerful exercise, and several international bids for landmarks in the city. We made conscious efforts, very strong efforts, I would say, focus on developing social and engineering infrastructure. And for the first time, again, they're openly accessible. So they are open for public access. People know where the metro will be, where the transport will ride. At first glance, you don't think it is so important, but for the person who knows, I see how important, how significant, how much better those steps are to the previous ones, where they were kind of secluded and closed, And in this respect, this type of research and exercise was targeted at self-realization, understanding ourselves, what we want to achieve, what is the main target, what's the core values that we should build on. And the checklist, as my colleague told, so that the public opinion and the authorities and experts should think around it. And I believe that Mr. Khusnullin, we're running slightly late with drafting those documents on planning Moscow and Moscow and environs. And the time is due to start here. You know, we're almost late. We should have started yesterday. And the decisions that have just been recommended, the solutions that we heard from the presenters seem to me very reasonable, very adequate. And I would draw your attention to the need of further improvement of democratic tools of development and their regulation in the city. We need to introduce the land use rules. We need to make the investment climate more transparent. We need to make the policy stricter regarding the development of territories, and the zoning regulation allows us to make it more stringent and clear for developers what exactly they should and are allowed to do. And I believe that the rules that still have been provided and shown to us now are getting obsolete. And before reinforcing them, we need to upgrade them, to refresh, to pump in a new blood into those rules. And for that, we need a new concept. Let it be a master plan. Certainly, master plan for both Moscow and Moscow regions, especially the new territories, the new Moscow. But we need the new conceptual basis to work out very clear, transparent, and pronounced rules and regulations and type and parameters of land use procedures and so forth. And I believe, in a sense, may the experts forgive me for saying that today the master plan as the concept and the zoning is even more important than the general plan. This is more important to launch new processes, to launch them. And growing the infrastructure at the periphery, yes, no doubt, but with one comment, it would be nice to find the spots where this growth should go at a more advanced pace and use the individual differentiated approach. I believe it would be quite fair in order to streamline the economic and planning development, differentiation approach to grow infrastructure. Then the circular connections between the highways, and it's right, and the Moscow government takes care. And the eternal, pain in the back, the street network, the street grid, everywhere, growing the streets in any form where we can. To increase the density is one of the most important goals, and the use of new formats of data that have been so brilliantly delivered in the Novikov's exercise. We need to make sure that we develop IT technologies allowing us to handle territorially distributed data from both mobile operators and in other areas, primarily in the economic area. So we should see how much a square meter yields, how much income it gives us, how much it contributes into the GDP, how many people are involved, and then we can talk about the advanced and sustainable economic policy and spatial planning, territorial planning. And the last, again, I would support in the proposals Mr. Muratov, who I trust focused very properly on the policies to the local communities and people involvement, the locals, involving the locals. This is another resource and a fresh topic for the Moscow government, which is now supported by everyone, including the mayor, primarily the mayor. We shall be listening at the Council of Communities, and I believe we should keep discussing because the future belongs to the local communities and the great potential to develop periphery of Moscow and other regions. Thank you very much.
Encouraging words. I'd like to now ask, if I could, Mr. Andrei Sharonov to also invite a few comments, perhaps, just from what you have heard today. Okay. Well, we will have a chance to come back to the audience, but I want to also turn back to our panel then for a moment to talk a bit about, again, the takeaways from this. And I will start. And so I was walking around, I was struck, first of all, by the use of data, the visualizations. I thought there was a real step forward in thinking of, and taking survey data and projecting that in a way which allowed people to see where people felt secure, where they felt insecure, where they felt, where they were poor or where they were rich, why they were traveling to different parts of the city. I found that use of data to be quite a step forward just in terms of the process. But one of the things I did not see perhaps as much as I would have liked to is this question around economics, and sort of the question of what is going to be the economic driver of the periphery. I mean, I think there was a general recognition that we need to capture more value in the periphery, and I think that the recommendations around policy and on property taxes and real estate taxes clearly go in that direction. And it's very hard for me to see, in fact, any sustainable urban development in the world that doesn't rely on some form of property-based tax. That it's almost a prerequisite for the city. So I'm sure this will come, but a little more specificity perhaps around which industries and how they should develop and what will be the source of competitive advantage, if I could say that, for the periphery. Why will the periphery be successful in attracting companies and investors for reasons that go beyond simply having a lot of cheap land? I think that area could be something to think about for the next forum. But overall, I think this is a terrific event because it brings together so many different communities, the communities that are in the audience and that are on the panel, from government, from academia, from business, and that is the dialogue of the city. The city is life. That is who we are. We come together and we create new ideas. So for me, that is, of course, that kind of a gathering is by definition a great opportunity. But let me turn over to my colleagues on the panel who are for things that you have taken away from the last 2 days that you think will be helpful in your own work, or ideas that you'd like to suggest for others to do work more on. Perhaps I start with yourself. Yes? Oh, sure. Yeah.
And talking about ecology, we failed to speak about that, but in previous session, ecological session, Brian Evans participated from Glasgow University, who spoke. So he was part of our team, and he was helping us to identify certain issues, ideas related to ecological policy vis-a-vis the periphery of Moscow. And we came, there was a metaphor, super park, it's kind of metaphor, and so in the distant, beautiful future. So it's certainly multi-layered metaphor. It should not be taken at its face value. But there was an ecological component there in this metaphor, which actually that these districts, these areas originally were created as inscribed a skeleton of green ambience, green periphery, and we need to bring back this ecological function that was designed in this way. And then the landscape could become an underpinning so what I would refer to as that's a landscape which contributes and works in capacity of creating a good climate, atmosphere, so then the collection of water, so against dust and clean and clear, pure environment, as that professor was speaking about that, a Toronto example, with this beautiful town park, and then the city, so then the farming inside the city, so that the patchwork, and so when people farm, it's in their backyards, and so vegetable gardens they have just behind their houses, and even from the viewpoint of food security, it can help as well. So there's a galore of different opportunities how to use this amount of land, and there's a lot of land in those administrative districts on the periphery. But all this policy of retention and evolution, it's ecologically targeted at the end of the day, because the countries that spend more and more money on power production, or France or Germany, so they understood that it's much better to insulate the existing houses rather than to knock it down and build another greenhouse, just to make it warmer.
Deputy Mayor, would you have anything that you see from this exhibit that you think is important to highlight, to say the things that you have taken away particularly from it?
I like the information of my colleague from London about the green belt, around London. We have a green belt around Moscow as well, and our planners many years ago, many decades ago, so they created a very huge a green belt, and it's categorically forbidden to build anything in that green belt. And I hope that you are aware of that, because we have the national park, which is referred to as an elk island. So then it's even forbidden to clear those woods, to clean the forest. So if the tree falls, it stays there. You can't touch it. And so that's how it was designed, and we need to value this legacy. And that's a very good point, that when we plan a new master plan and when we start developing new master, we need to retain the good points. We need to retain the good things that we had. We should not just cross them out. We should not strike them. And so we need to bring these green parks in conformity with the way they should be. And so because 30% of the territory of Moscow is the woods, is the forests. And unfortunately, not all of it is used. We have a huge long-term program to develop those territories. 30% is green. And this wealth should be maintained, should be protected. And so that's a very good idea. And so now plans will remember about this certainty and the green belts. And then about the periphery, again, another point that I like. So what struck me as most unusual, there was a research, a study that a lot of citizens on periphery, so about 30%, they don't leave their district. They stay there. It wasn't expected to us. And so we didn't know this is a new development, because we thought that it was kind of centrifugal forces, centripetal forces going to the center, out of center. But it's not all. Not many just tripping over themselves to get to downtown. They don't want that. And so then people live in their own district and they're happy there. Then there is another indicator. So this old planned in Soviet times, those old administrative districts, they support the existing power, because the highest election voting is done in those administrative districts, because we think that they are periphery, but they're most loyal, conscientious citizens of Moscow, because the highest voting turnout comes from periphery, because they know what to vote for. They support the authorities, so they're very loyal, and they are the golden backbone of ours, because they support, because they've been living there for many years and they like where they live, and so that's a very important factor. factor that we did not realize the importance of it. And so now, just when we start planning our city, we need to plan how to retain this lifestyle in those green, old, nice districts. Yes, because certainly then the industrial zones will impact on them, and so our task is to minimize this existing way of life. So we need to keep them, and we need to religiously save them. And so these are the two most important points that
It shows just the power of having some facts and some data so you actually understand, so the research can shape the policy, as Ricky was saying. I'm going to jump, if I could. Mr. Novikov, things that you took away from the forum, sort of thoughts that you might want to share, things that struck you.
So it was very interesting to watch the discussion, and for myself, just that Moscow faces a dilemma. It's a strange simile, like Germany in the 50s was facing the same dilemma, what was building its own economy. And Erhard, who was a liberal economist at the time, and he was fighting for the market theory. So he had a strange mission because he needed to introduce institutions of rationalizing, rationing, bringing food cards, controlling institutions, so the state sector, so nationalizing companies after World War II. But at that time he was saying that that these measures were necessary. But the moment I think it's possible, I will abandon them all. But and that's what he was saying. So about the rationing system, etc. And in Moscow, although I'm a liberal economist, so by the style of my thinking, I'm all liberal to the marrow of my bones. But I think that a very important instrument, there should be a policy, a stringent, strict policy, transparent policy, but strict policy. Which would contain, this is the order of the day, it's certainty, so the investor should know what can be done and what they expect here or there in which district. And in the present day form, these restrictions, constraints of the market with these the markets with the systems of zoning, so they've been tested, they're good, and they need to be applied. And so I do not see any. There is no panacea of all ills because in zoning, so there are lots of drawbacks, and we've seen it before. But Moscow in a situation where this kind of city developing solutions are very important. Zoning, and it's good that it's been verbalized today. And this concern was voiced that we need the inter-municipal mechanisms of cooperation between Moscow and Moscow region. So they can be addressed within the framework of different formats: commissions, cooperation, unification of tax conventions, agreements. So because this unification of Moscow and Moscow region, because I don't want just to put them together because it's kind of a blunt, stupid decision, but to unify, to harmonize. So the way Moscow region operates, the way Moscow operates, will be very important because it will iron out many mistakes. And then when I was watching your deliberations, listening, so there is one point. We still think of Moscow as a city of, so we talk about business trips, we talk about food traffic, we mean job traffic, so people just migrate to work and back. This is the philosophy of 50-year-old philosophy, because Moscow is becoming a postmodernist city, because they move around, not only because they go to work and back, but because they just move around because they want to be so socially full, they want to be culturally full, they're using differently the spatial infrastructure of the city. And it's not only by business that they travel, it's not only because they go to work that they travel. It's becoming multidimensional attitude, and that will be the most important conclusion that the authorities should be aware of, because the city hard disk is not ready for that. So then the map actually showed that the transportation infrastructure of Moscow is an archipelago of islands. That's what Moscow is. If you compare it with St. Petersburg, St. Petersburg is lots of bridges connected with bridges, but Moscow is more islandish in its nature than St. Petersburg is. So it's just capillaries, the small vessels, big vessels, and it connects the city with this vasculature. And the idea is not to conserve, not to ossify this structure. And think only in terms of work and to work and back. But Moscow needs to increase the density of its fine vasculature, and for and not only think about those who work in Moscow.
Mr. Dunham-Jones, I was wondering, I mean, as you now have had these couple of days here, what will you take back to the Congress of New Urbanism and to Georgia?
Again. I'm going to take back, I think, a lot of really strong impressions. And, you know, I think I've already kind of said my takeaway principally is just the importance of the walkable street grid. That just gets reinforced pretty much everywhere I go. But a couple of things I wanted to just give as sort of parting comments. It's absolutely fabulous that the research is here. I totally agree with that. But don't stop now. I really would like to just emphasize the importance of future research and encourage the city of Moscow to require some degree of monitoring by property owners of how their properties are performing as you go forward and as you, especially as you redevelop areas. We need more and more data to better understand how these places are performing. And I think especially as Moscow begins to introduce mixed-use neighborhoods, that's a new way of living for Muscovites. And I think, you know, it would be wonderful to really have some future research that actually looks at what is the impact on travel behavior of people being, if you have jobs and housing together, how much does it mean you could actually begin to resize some of your projections about the capacity of your roadway network, you know, or not? Are people not really making use of that? What is the performance in terms of equity as you get more mixed use, potentially a variety of mixed incomes, especially how does that impact women and the poor? Do they end up with more access to opportunities or not, depending on how you've designed different projects? Can you do some research on not just the return on investment for the private investors, but the return on public investment in infrastructure? And we're seeing more and more cities really beginning to develop more sophisticated ways of actually really making those kinds of analyses. What is the impact on affordability, on public health, on environmental health? You know, the list just goes on and on. It's fabulous that you've got the research that you have, but I think we're always in the field of urban design in general, and in urbanism and planning cities, we don't do enough analysis of actually how places are performing. And I think you're embarking on this quite a significant change, and you want to know how it really impacts, and you can make that a requirement, actually, of your rezoning if you choose to. The second thing I wanted to say is that I'm really struck with how many young people are in the audience. And I'm so excited and delighted to see so many young people that are here listening to all of these talks. But I haven't seen them on the stage quite so much and speaking. And so their voices are heard somewhat, certainly through the research, through the exhibition downstairs of what Moscow wants. But certainly the experience we're seeing in the US, I think certainly in Europe, in Asia, it's a sea change of the generations kind of between those of us with gray hair and the younger generation in terms of what they value, what they want to see in their cities, the lifestyles that they want to lead. the sort of, you know, stereotype, the sort of stereotype in the U.S. is that the millennials will give up their cars before they'll give up their cell phones. 75% grew up in the city, grew up in the periphery, but 77% want to live in the city. They want a more urban lifestyle. You know, they'll take the bus if it has Wi-Fi rather than drive, but they also value face-to-face, and they really want great public spaces, and they want to do they want to be empowered to reclaim public spaces, like all of those ideas that are downstairs in the exhibition. So I think you've got, the next generation is right here. They're listening, they're eager, but I would just sort of say, I think all of us need to listen to them even more.
Thank you. Ricky, you get the last word as the expert.
Well, I think the earlier point is worth just reiterating. The mere fact that an event like this takes one big issue and really looks at it very, very seriously, rather than try to do everything, is very, very important. I think that's significant, as is the point that has now been made by everyone here about the connection with research. But I guess the most important thing of these events, and the most important takeaway, is what happens from 6:30 on, not what has happened from up until now. What do the policymakers really take away? What are the major lessons to be learned? And I think there are some very clear indications around intensification, around the connection between what Jonathan was saying of the environmental, the social, and the environmental altogether, because they are pointing, I think, in the same direction. I think, again, in the spirit of being a constructive friend, it was exciting to see so many ideas, some of them crazy, downstairs, you know, lively, exciting, crazy things to do, but I saw very few of them presented, like you were saying, lack of young people here, I agree, but very few architects and visionaries presenting ideas to everyone, to share them, because I think a provocation of what sort of street we're imagining for the future neighborhoods, you know, if your statistic, Deputy Mayor, of you know, people moving around far less into the center was extremely interesting, but therefore what does that mean in terms of that future neighborhood? How do you create those more mixed environments over there so that they don't move in? So I think combining, I would say, the visual, the aesthetic, the pleasurable, the experiential is something which needs to go through the thinking process from this point on, I think, within the policy world. I have been struck by how open you have been. The fact that the mayor was here for an hour and a half this morning and more times. I can tell you Boris Johnson would not spend 2 hours at a conference in London. I can tell you that. He would be thinking of doing other things, and therefore I think that's a very, very important statement and message, and of course to take home. Jonathan, I would say one reflection that perhaps we should all take away from events or presentations of what we see is, and this is now arguing against myself and against what many of us say, is the reminder of two things. One is that whatever we say, we're going to be wrong. Right? If you think of what planners in London were saying, not to mention prime ministers in 2006 and 2007, think how wrong they were about the economy. You know, the economy just collapsed. You know, do we trust ourselves? The Queen of Great Britain came to the London School of Economics, and the first thing she said to the economists, she said, weren't you supposed to tell the future? Weren't you supposed to predict all this? Why did you get it wrong? This is the Queen of England actually saying this, which is quite interesting. So I think one of the things we need to do is be modest and think of all the models as being far more resilient to change. And I mean this even at the level of the buildings that we create. One of the great things in Britain over the last years is that because of the economy, we've been able to convert all the empty offices into housing. Now, if I look at some of your new offices or new housing, I don't think you could convert them over time. So this resilience at all levels, I think, is incredibly important. Therefore, designing massive new motorways maybe works now, but not in 20 or 30 years. That's the first point. The second point I realized coming to this conference is at one level how cities around the world are the same, but actually how different they are. How fundamentally different the issues you have in Moscow are from the ones in London, New York, Shanghai, Mumbai, or others. And here you have very particular conditions, which I certainly will not try and summarize. They're very clear, they've been mentioned today. But I also realize that some cities are on the global stage more than others. And there are probably 3 or 4, and Moscow is one of them, where it's not just important that you get things right for everyone who lives here, and importantly everyone who will live here, from different ethnicities and different generations. But the world is watching you, as the world has watched London maybe for 100 years, to be innovative and courageous in terms of what you do next. And this is why all these new policies which connect the economy, social and environmental, if you do it, other people will have the courage to do it. And I think that is one of the enormous values of an event like this.
Thank you. Well, I feel compelled to sort of, first of all, second your vote for resilience. And I think resilience as a quality of a great city is in its very definition. First of all, as we say, cities are the single most complicated thing that we as a human species do. They are the most long-lived assets. They are the most complex networks. So, but if we want it to work, it has to be flexible, it has to be sustainable, it has to react to the uncertain. So I actually enjoyed when you put up the chart of saying this is the London plan, because in fact I think that pretty much does capture the essence of the London plan. It's an idea, and it's an idea that has principles around it, but the capability to respond, to the understanding of how to hold a debate. And so today we had a lot of discussion about citizen engagement, about the conversation that happens around a project. That's the critical aspect of a plan. And so I often say let's abandon this notion of the word plan. I mean, if the plan is a book that we put on the shelf and then we say it's done, then that is of very little use to us. What we need is an ability to respond in a sense of principles, and importantly, a capability. And with that big part of that capability, I would say, as Professor Jonas said, is data. If we do not have the data, we can't know how to respond. So in New York, over the last 3 years, they've gathered data on 10,000 buildings as energy efficiency. So now we know which buildings are the most energy efficient, and we can actually start to do something. And surprisingly enough, the best and most energy efficient buildings are the oldest buildings. So the buildings that were built before 1930. So, who knew? I mean, we might have put in an entirely different plan if we didn't have that data. So data is actually a prerequisite to having an effective response. And so here, what I also think is noteworthy to me is that you have this new Moscow is an incredible ambition. This is a size, an expansion on the scale of which I have seen very few cities in the world do. And certainly in such a short period of time. So this is a very bold and brave aspiration. It's a 50 to 100 year journey. The only other place I can think of that has quite such aspirations and quite such scale is, of course, China. So what I'm hoping is that the experience, then the data and the practice that we learn from forums like this here in Moscow, we can use in China, and that we can have a conversation together with the Beijing city authorities. Comes to mind, first of all, is to say, now for your 6th ring road, Beijing is out to number 6 right now. How are we going to fill in the periphery between the number 4 ring road and the number 6 ring road using the examples from here in Moscow? So I'm hoping that maybe next year at this time, we can have some experts from Moscow come to Beijing and have that conversation with the city government using data that we have been gathering from our experience in building here in Russia. So with that, I believe we are now at the conclusion of the 4th plenary. I want to thank the audience. I would like to thank our panel, and I especially like to thank the organizers for making a great 2 days. I'm sure that we will all hold in our hearts and our minds. Thank you.